this is the range within which it's undoubtedly most likely to fall, unless the polls are really significantly overestimating Labour's lead over the Conservatives. I think certainly, given history, we wouldn't be entirely surprised if there was a bit of an exaggeration of the lead. But so long as that's no more of the order of 2, 3, 4 points, then something in that range seems at least possible, though if the polls are somewhat wrong, then maybe towards the upper end of that range.
Right.
Labour are now predicted to win the biggest majority for any single party since 1832, with 212 seats. A majority of 212 is what it should say there. The poll, based on interviews with more than 40,000 people across the country, put the Tories on 22%, Labour on 39% and Reform UK on 15%. Well, joining us with a full breakdown is the Director of Political Analytics and YouGov spokesman on political research, Patrick English. Your title's getting longer every time you come into the studio, Patrick. Break this down for us. This is more damning for the Conservatives than your last big MRP poll, which is the big sophisticated poll where you go constituency by constituency.
Yes, that's exactly right. So this is our final call of the election. This is what we think is going to happen tomorrow after the ballot boxes close, the count begins, and we start to find out the results. And the Conservatives are down 6 seats from our last projection 2 weeks ago. Labour are up 2. The Liberal Democrats are also up. And the story really is one, I think, of quite a bit of consistency. This is broadly where we started at the start of this campaign, and it's broadly where we're going to finish, with a significant Labour lead in vote intention polls, around about 20 points, and all the signs pointing to a hefty majority. Now, it should also be said that these forecasts, these super polls, we spoke to 48,000 people over the past couple of weeks, they always come with margins of error, and they always come with uncertainty. And the range of scenarios that we've seen in the data today suggests anything from something like a smaller majority than 1997 all the way up to an even bigger record-breaking landslide. And the Conservatives could be on under 100 seats. They could be anything up to about 130. So there's lots of different scenarios and lots of different possibilities within what we're seeing at the minute.
I think as a general rule, we know Labour will undoubtedly walk away with the election, but the things to watch out for, as you said, are how big the majority is, how much of the Conservatives are eaten into, in terms of the number of seats that they are left with. There was another MRP poll for More in Common a little bit earlier that had the Tories on 126. You, of course, have them on 102. So that is something to watch out for, because, of course, the Conservative Party is going to have to do some sort of rebuilding effort, and how bad the news is for them will determine what their next move is. What happens to those people that are re-elected as MPs? What kind of a job have they got to do, and what is the future direction of the party? Rishi Sunak will be asking himself lots of questions as well. The Liberal Democrats, we haven't spoken maybe not enough about them during this election in terms of them being a bit of a success story for where they are now in terms of the number of seats. They've got, 13, something like that?
I think it was 11 last time
11, apologies. I've slightly over-egging that. So 11 for the Lib Dems, and they're projected to get 72 seats.
Yep.
So look, we mustn't underestimate that either, that the Liberal Democrats are going to have a much larger say, if the polls are correct, in some of those policies that get over the line. Arguably, Labour have got such a strong majority that they are sort of going to want, or going to be able to get, whatever they want done when it comes to policies, etc. What else should we look out for here?
Yeah, I think the point about the Liberal Democrats is a really good one. And look, there's a scenario in the intervals that we've published today where Ed Davey is the leader of the opposition. The upper band of the Liberal Democrats surpasses the lower band of the Conservatives. So there is a world, there is a simulation, or a bunch of simulations in the data.
How do you feel about that, though? Do you think that would be quite fantastical?
I think it's certainly
likely.
It's not very likely,
No.
but it is. The model, the data are telling us that is a possibility, as is the possibility that the Conservatives actually have a slightly better night than we are estimating, and we're more in the sort of more in common territory of where they might end up. But the other thing to look out for, of course, is this speaks to the way that the vote is going at the minute. This isn't a two-party swing election, even though the sort of the headline figures, as headline seat numbers, are swinging between two parties, the Conservatives and Labour. This is driven by a huge fragmentation in that Conservative 2019 voter coalition that propelled Boris Johnson to power it's breaking down in front of us. And some of it's going to Labour, more of it is going to Reform UK, some of it to the Liberal Democrats, some of it even to the Greens. The Greens' best chances of winning a third or a fourth seat come in some very rural Conservative areas, Waveney Valley and North Herefordshire. So there's all kinds of different dynamics and all kinds of different ways that Conservative vote is splitting. And that's why they're down at 100, maybe 120, maybe even sub 100 seats.
Let's talk about Scotland as well, because Labour looked to be building up a bit of a lead over the SNP, but that has levelled out. So what we thought was going to happen here, which was a narrowing of the polls between the Conservatives and Labour, is definitely happening to the SNP and Labour. Some polls sort of putting them neck and neck. Where do you sit in terms of Scotland?
So we believe Labour are just about ahead of the SNP. We also believe that will give them the mantle of being the largest party in Scotland, again, something they haven't held, of course, since 2010. There is a lot of uncertainty around that, though, as well. Scotland has the highest percentage of marginals of any area of the United Kingdom. So the two parties can be anywhere within 5 points of each other, and you can get all kinds of different seat totals and all kinds of different relationships as to how that vote will break down in terms of seats. So Scotland is very, very difficult to predict. Currently, we think that Labour are going to be the largest party, but the SNP probably have recovered a little bit of ground. But to make the point, our intervals are sort of the credible intervals for what we think is going to happen with the SNP on Thursday, range from anything down from 8 seats all the way up to 34.
Wow, so that is broad.
Broad, indeed.
All right, thank you so much for being with us. You are and have been touring a lot of the TV and broadcast studios. You're a busy man, I know. Thanks so much for being with us. Patrick
My pleasure.
English,
Always a pleasure.
Director of Political Analytics and YouGov spokesman on political research. Our thanks.
Welcome to Luke Tryl from More in Common for our look at digest analysis of all these opinion polls, which have been coming as if from an open tap today. Hello to you, Luke.
Good evening, John.
Always welcome, especially today, but especially today. So, look, that little flood of polls we've been seeing today, especially those detailed mega polls, Luke, what are the big standout points that you take away as you look at them with your computer-like eye?
Well, we've had 3 more today of those MRP polls, which allow you to make individual constituency projections. And I think my top line takeaway is that all 3 of them are catastrophic for the Conservatives and suggest we are heading towards a record-breaking Labour majority.
Yeah.
So just to take you through some of the totals, in More in Common's MRP, that was ours. We had the Conservatives on 126, Labour on 430. YouGov, very similar on Labour, 431, but the Conservatives on 102 there. Focal data, Labour on 444, the Conservatives on just 108.
Yeah.
So all 3 of those models projecting the Conservatives to be under 130 seats, worst result in the history of the Conservative Party.
Yeah, we just got to say wow when you see polling results like that. I mean, there's a range in what different pollsters say the next House of Commons might actually look like. One of your fellow pollsters, I think it was Savanta, gave it a 99% chance that the scale of a Labour win, when and if that Labour win is declared, would be as big or bigger than Labour's landslide in 1997. A 99% chance. Would you stick your neck out that far and say it is that? Just about as good as certain, Luke?
I might go slightly lower to the sort of 80% or so. I mean, our projected range is slightly different to that one from Survation. The Survation one has the Conservatives, right down in the 60s, but I should say is done by a very experienced team who've got a lot of track record in doing this. I would take it very seriously. Yeah. But I think, it is certainly more likely than not now that we are in territory which is beyond 1997.
Where's your corridor of certainty, to borrow a phrase from the great Jeff Boycott? Where would you be prepared to hang your hat by way of a firm prediction on the size of the results?
Well, look, I think, what was interesting in our MRP, and I think YouGov and Focal Data did similar today, was look at, there are a number of seats where even though we've made projections, they're within 2% or within 5%. And the truth is that type of seat could go anywhere. And so what we've said, on the Conservative range, looking at that, is at the very high. If all of the marginals break for the Conservatives, they'd be on about 170. If all of them break against the Conservatives, they'd be on sort of 75 seats. So that, I think, is the upper and lower end of where I would put what looks like, a bad night on any level for the Conservatives.
Right. Let's look at what's going through the mind of the voters. There's some pretty strong evidence and very strong numbers, Luke, that say that what most people are thinking about is they just want to change. They just want to kick out the present government. I'm looking at some numbers here. The desire for change has increased over the course of the campaign from 70, which is pretty high, up to 74. But the view that Keir Starmer and Labour represent change, well, that's down from 51 to 45, so fewer than half. So, different people will have different views and different degrees of strength. However, it's for a lot of people, it's more about changing things than buying into or embracing or loving what they be buying and taking after the election.
Oh, absolutely. And if there's one thing that comes out of, both that polling, but also the focus groups we've been done, is a real sort of paradox, actually, that the country is genuinely desperate for change. It comes up all the time in conversations with voters, this feeling that the country is broken, everything's just too difficult, nothing works, they want it to get better. And yet at the same time, a lack of faith that whoever wins the election will actually be able to make a meaningful difference. And a sense that, the sort of median quote I get in a focus group is, well, we may as well roll the dice on this lot because at least they're not the ones who are in power now.
Yes.
And I think that means, that when we're hopefully talking about polls when Labour are in government, the big challenge for Labour is going to be how do they meet those public expectations of change, and how do they do it quickly? Because, I think it's fair to say even the most generous Labour strategist would say that whilst, Keir Starmer has changed opinions of the Labour Party, he has been more the beneficiary of Conservatives losing popularity.
Yes.
Great wave of love for the Labour Party.
It's that old dictum that governments lose elections more than oppositions win them. And when we get to the night itself, we're going to be looking for the big scalps to be taken, the big names to fall. We talked about cabinet ministers on some of these polls. These are forecasts falling like 9 pence. Then there are other stories like Jeremy Corbyn and Islington North. We're going to be watching that one. That's an interesting human and political story. Luke, what's the latest on that? I think there's a suggestion he could hang on in there against Labour.
Yeah, so in our MRP, we have Jeremy Corbyn leading. I should give heavy pollsters warning and caveat that specific local factors, it's quite difficult for these polls. I think YouGov have him just narrowly behind. So, if you look at those two, it basically suggests there is still a race there. So that's, a particularly interesting one. And as you say, all of those cabinet ministers, we in fact today had to almost create an extra section of the website for the number of cabinet ministers who were at risk, because it's at 15. 15 potential, as they become known, Portillo moments that could take place tomorrow evening.
Good to have you here, Tom.
Hello.
So look, tell us, we've got some more polls coming in now. A big one from the pollster YouGov.
Yeah, that's right.
What can you share with us?
So it's the final mega poll of the campaign. It's 43,000 people who've been polled. And the results are this. So Labour is set for 431 seats in the Commons. The Tories reduced to 102. The Lib Dems on 72, SNP on 18, Plaid Cymru on 3, Reform on 3, and the Greens on 2. So, we've got quite used to these mega polls, haven't we? So I think it's probably worth setting that into context. So every MRP YouGov has done this year has gotten progressively worse for the Conservatives. So at the very start of the year, they had them on 169 seats, which would still have been bad, but sort of in 1997 defeat-style territory. But sort of bit by bit, with every progressive poll, it's gotten worse. And now, of course, they're down to 102, which is pretty bad.
Yeah, it's still quite a range, though. I mean, look, from one end of that range of Conservative tally of seats to the other end of the predicted range in the polls of Conservative tally of seats, they all point to absolute disaster for the Conservative Party. But there's still quite a broad range there.
There really is. And I mean, this isn't the only mega poll that we've had today, and they all say slightly different things. So there was one There was one from More in Common earlier, which had them on 430, but one yesterday by Salvation, another pollster, which had had Labour on 484 seats. So we're talking about big differences of 50, 60 seats. One of them's got to be right, one of them's got to be wrong. We don't know who.
Yeah, I mean, so what apart from those headline figures, the predictions of seats, those forecasts of seats, what leaps out for you from the polling data that we've seen about why people are thinking the way that they are thinking?
Well, I think one thing that really jumps out in this is tactical voting.
Yeah.
So it's been very hard to poll tactical voting until you actually get into the sort of reads of the campaign. But what's really interesting, in seats where the Lib Dems came first or second in 2019, now the Lib Dems are on 39%. They're the most popular party. But in seats where Labour came first or second last time, the Lib Dems are on just 7%, with Labour on 44%. So it really looks as though in the data like they're avoiding each other. And I think this is one of the crucial things that will spell catastrophe for the Conservatives tomorrow.
Right, Tom, I ask you, if you didn't mind me asking you this next question off mic a moment ago, just in case anyone thinks I'm being incredibly mean. Do you mind sharing your guess? There's a sweepstake, I know, in your team.
Yes.
Where are you in that?
Personally, I think it's going to be, I'm going to go with the Conservatives on 102,
right,
and I'm going to go with Labour on 450. So that'd be a majority of 250.
Okay, Tom, we'll see how that goes on. Who wins your sweepstake? Do pop back and tell us how that went with your team.
The election campaign of 2024 began with a big Labour lead baked into the polls, and it's ending with a big Labour lead baked into the polls. In the words of Theresa May, in another context, nothing has changed. Or has it? Let's speak to Peter Kellner, pollster, former president of YouGov. Peter, let me come straight to the first question here. In terms of polls, has anything changed these past 6 weeks?
A little bit has changed, Andrew. Labour is down a bit. The Conservatives are down a bit. The Lib Dems are up a bit. Reform is up a bit bigger. It looks to me the Labour-Tory gap, which stayed pretty well constant until a few days ago, has very, very slightly narrowed. There's signs now that Labour is drifting below 40%, the share of the vote, and the Conservatives, to me, fairly securely above 20%. Now, whether that'll continue or reverse in the last 24 hours, I'm not so sure. But at the moment, it looks to me as if the Conservatives are facing a catastrophe, but not quite the extinction that looked possible 2 or 3 weeks ago.
So on the eve of voting, are you saying, Peter, the best way to think of it, the final polls before everyone goes to the ballot box, is that Labour a little bit above 40 and the Tories around 20? And so that gap of 20 has pretty much stayed.
Well, no, almost that, Andrew. I reckon in the last 24 hours, I've seen 7 final polls from different companies. And looking at them together, it looks to me as if Labour's a bit below 40 now, and the Tories, let's just say 38-39 Labour against 2021 Conservative. So we're looking at a 17 or 18% lead, which is, of course, enormous. Nothing in the post-war era, with the possible exception of Margaret Thatcher's landslide in 1983, has approached it. But whereas it was 20 or 21% 2 or 3 weeks ago, it's that little bit closer.
Well, it will be of significance. It won't affect the result, and Labour's majority will still be huge, however you cut it. But it will be significant in some ways if that Labour vote is actually just a little tad under 40%, because that means that it would be likely that Keir Starmer would win a supermajority with a lower share of the vote, quite a bit lower, than Theresa May got when she lost her majority in 2017. What do we make of that?
And indeed, could well be below the figure that Labour got on Jeremy Corbyn against Theresa May in 2017, when Labour got, I think, 41% of the vote, and Labour lost. And it could well add up with under 38-39%. And win. But it's partly obviously because the right of centre vote is split. But there's something else, Andrew, which I think is of significance, that the combined, well, we know that the Tories are going to be miles worse than any general election since Robert Peel founded them almost 200 years ago, well short of the previous worst Tory performance. But if you add the Tory and Labour likely votes together, that'll probably come out at about 60%, 60, 61. The lowest two-party total we've had in British history was in 2010 when it was 67%. So we're going to get 4 out of 10 people shunning both main parties. And no British election in modern or indeed ancient times have we seen anything like 40% shunning the two big parties of the day.
Well, it could be seen then, Peter, to reinforce the view that although the country wants to see the back of the Tories, and there can be little doubt of that, and it wants to see the back big time, they're not exactly gagging for Mr. Starmer or his party. The way they actually didn't want just rid of the Tories in 97, they actually were rather looking forward to the Blair-Brown Labour Party.
No, that's absolutely right, Andrew. One of the questions I've been asked a lot in the last few weeks, as I'm sure you have been, is if Labour gets a landslide victory, does that guarantee 10 years? Does it guarantee they'll in the next election, not just this one? And my response is not at all, because the Labour landslide is more than anything a function of the division on the right. If the Conservatives get their acts together between now and the next election, then the vote that Labour gets this time, even if it holds just absolutely still that they don't lose any votes, it may not be enough next time to give them a secure victory. It's a historically not only full of records, but in many ways a very strange election.
Well, I'm taking on board what you say, Peter, because on election night in 2019, when the exit poll came in, giving a lead that surprised a lot of us about the size of the Tory lead, I remember saying live on air that this was a Tory majority for 2 terms. I hadn't taken into account Mr. Johnson's ability to screw that up. So I'm not going to say that again because of what you've just said. And I would also suggest that Labour, as they take over the reins of power, need to be a bit careful perhaps and just keep in mind that their support is an ocean wide, but it's maybe just a village pond deep.
Yeah, that's right. Look, in 1997, as I said earlier, Labour came to power with a very popular new Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and in very kind economic circumstances. They could throw quite a lot of money at quite a lot of issues like health and education, and then have another landslide 4 years later. Well, now we have Keir Starmer, whose ratings are miles better than Rishi Sunak's, but they're not that great, and very difficult economic circumstances. But my view, if I may just leave the numbers for a moment, I think it's vital for Labour to establish a narrative at the very, very beginning, which is much closer to Churchill's blood, toil, tears and sweat than it is to Blair's things can only get better.
Yes, glad morning again, as Ronald Reagan put it at one stage. And Blair kind of, it was a beautiful May Day back in 97, May the 1st, the sun was shining. It did seem like a new, as Mr. Blair said, a new dawn has broken, has it not? We all remember that. Peter, the Tories in the final days of this campaign, they seem reduced to trying to stop a Labour supermajority. That, of course, implies that Labour is getting a majority. As a general proposition, as an approach to fighting elections, is that even a credible strategy?
Well, if we were winding the clock back 6 weeks to the very beginning and the Tories were making a real effort to win the election, no, because what has been absolutely constant throughout this election, and I've been following the polls, as you can imagine, with some care every day, the number supporting Conservative plus Reform, if you like, the right bloc, has been pretty well constant, and the left bloc, Labour, Liberal Democrats, Green, SNP and so on, that has been constant, and it's been roughly high 50s to the left, high 30s to the right. There was no way the Conservatives would win that election without eating in to the centre-left voters. But as it's become clear that those voters are not going to move, all the Conservatives can do is maximise their votes amongst the right of centre, the 35, 38% to the right of centre. That means going after the shy Tories. That means going after Reform. All that ends up doing is reducing their defeats, but it's never been a strategy for winning the election.
Now, the Times is reporting now Rishi Sunak is seeking to win back around 180,000 Reform UK supporters in key parliamentary seats, which he believes will have a very significant impact on the shape of the next House of Commons and the future of his party. Let's talk to John Curtice. Sir John Curtice, the British political scientist and very well known on-air psephologist. Welcome to you, John.
Good afternoon to you.
John, can I start, as it were, with you, with the end of the conversation first? When I was talking to Frank Lutz, a very well-known American pollster, he said that, if he was pushed into a corner, John, he'd predict the Conservatives being reduced to maybe 120 or 130 seats. Do you want to tell me what you might expect to see, subject to all the obvious caveats?
Well, the honest truth is that we're none of us entirely sure, except that we think the Conservatives are certainly at risk of suffering a serious defeat. I shared a panel with James Kanagasuriam, who's the person who invented the Red Wall, and Matt Singh, who is the person who spotted that the polls might be wrong in 2015. And between a few days ago, and between us, we agreed that any figure for the Conservatives between 50 and 150 was potentially credible. This isn't just simply to do with what share of the vote the Conservatives are going to get, which in the opinion polls on average at the moment, that we'll get a forest of them, I suspect, in the next 24 hours, is running at about 20%, actually slightly more than that in the so-called mega polls. So that's obviously a problem for the Conservatives. But that, in theory, could still leave them with about 200 seats. The problem is, and what we're uncertain about, is the extent to which the Conservative seat vote is actually going to fall more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. Some of that is certainly bound to happen simply because there are around 100 constituencies where the Conservative vote cannot fall by the 25 points to which the polls on average point, because they didn't have 25% in those constituencies last time.
Yes.
That's point number one. And point number two is it's pretty clear, because the Brexit Party did not contest Conservative-held seats in 2019, that Reform are going to do most damage to the Conservatives in the very places they're trying to hang on. But and you see this in very different estimates in the mega polls as to whether or not indeed the Tories are going to end up with 50 or 150. They differ in terms of the strength of the relationship that they're anticipating between the size of the fall in Conservative support and the level of Conservative support in the past.
Yes.
On average, however, those polls are saying that perhaps the Conservatives will end up with around 100, which therefore means that Frank is, if anything, very slightly on the optimistic side as compared with the average of the mega polls.
Interesting. Now, John, I realise you are a scientist and not a clairvoyant, but a couple of times now you've mentioned that range of possible Conservative Party strength in the next House of Commons as between 50 and 150. Does that seem to you to be in your water, as it were, to be the most likely realistic range?
Yeah, I mean, this is the range within which it's undoubtedly most likely to fall, unless the polls are really significantly overestimating Labour's lead over the Conservatives. I think certainly, given history, we wouldn't be entirely surprised if there was a bit of an exaggeration of the lead. But so long as that's no more of the order of 2, 3, 4 points, then something in that range seems at least possible. Though if the polls are somewhat wrong, then maybe towards the upper end of that range.
Right. So, but even at the top end of that range, that would still amount to an absolutely crushing defeat. Now, as for the Prime Minister saying 130,000 votes in marginal seats could have a huge effect on the outcome in Parliament, there's truth in that, isn't there?
Yeah, sure.
But that doesn't mean we're watching a close fight, curiously.
No, well, the reason why that's the case is that if indeed we are right in anticipating that the Conservative vote is going to fall most heavily in places where they are previously strongest, that will in effect mean that we have many more seats that are marginal between Conservative and Labour, and indeed between Conservative and Democrats, than would otherwise be the case. Again, that's one of the messages of those big mega polls, that an awful lot of constituencies could end up on one side or the other of the line as a result of relatively small shifts in the votes, which again is yet another reason for the uncertainty. You know, the uncertainty doesn't seem to be about the winner. The uncertainty is about what happens in terms of parliamentary representation.
Yes.
And, you know, given the vagaries of the single-member party system, it requires an accurate estimate of what's going to happen in 632 entirely separate contests.
Yes.
And with the best will of the world and the best scientists in the world, that is a very, very difficult task.
How far will turnout, or could turnout, affect the result? Because that could be a very significant factor when it comes to looking at where the result falls in a range of possibilities.
Well, it could, but it's only if you believe that the motivation for one side to turn out and vote is markedly greater or less than that of another side. I suspect that all the parties will have something of a struggle to get people to turn out and vote, simply because A, the poll says it's all over by the shouting, B, the Labour's move to the centre means that there's not a great deal of difference between the parties. Add to that the fact that none of our party leaders really have enthused the electorate, though I've heard your interesting conversation about Sir Ed Davey. And meanwhile, we know that there's fairly widespread distrust of politicians in general. Put all that together, and it does seem as though we've got a recipe for many a voter to say, well, to be honest, it's not really worth the shoe leather. And of course, the difficulties with the postal votes won't have helped the turnout either. So, whether we'll be as low as the 59% in 2001, who knows? But I would be surprised if we ended up with the 68, 69% we've had in recent elections. But that could just simply mean that both Labour and Conservative voters feel somewhat less impelled to go to the polls than perhaps they would have been a few years ago.
Yeah, but given, I suppose, the Conservative Party in particular, their predicament, the warnings about a supermajority, they made our eyebrows shoot up when we first heard that apparent concession of doom on the way for the Tories. But perhaps it works. It maybe has made a difference. It makes sense from a campaigning point of view.
It does if you think that people are concerned that the Conservative Party may be about to be treated rather unfairly by the electoral system. Well, you have to remember that at the end of the day, no voter has control over the electoral system. We all faithfully cast our individual votes, but frankly, it's within the geography of created by the boundary commissions as to what our votes actually end up meaning, and none of us can really be fully in charge of that. And secondly, quite a lot of evidence out there that quite a lot of voters feel that the Conservative Party do actually deserve a bit of a drubbing, and therefore I think we could exaggerate and that includes many a person who voted Conservative in 2019. I think we could seriously exaggerate the extent to which voters are sitting there and saying, well, I know the Conservatives haven't done a terribly good job. I really am rather disenchanted with them, but I'm still going to vote for them because I want them to be in opposition and I want them to be effective.
Really interesting. Your thoughts on what's going on through those target voters' minds. Now, look, when we look at reform, they are now around 4 points behind in the polls, the generality of the polls. We're going to end up in another situation. I know this is more politics than science, John. We're going to end up in another situation where we see one of those upstart parties landing millions of votes and a tiny number of seats. But this time, we can expect, can't we, more of a discussion, a debate, an inquest on our anciently established first past the post voting system.
That's certainly perfectly conceivable, and at the moment it looks as though Labour might get 40%, even slightly less than that of the vote, and could get 70% of the seats. Oh, the Liberal Democrats, by the way, who usually lose out, some of the projections suggest they might get around 10, 11% of the vote and around 10 or 11% of the seats. So they might be a little less grumpy than in the past, but the Conservatives look as though they're going to lose out seriously. Certainly, if, as we were talking about earlier, we were towards the lower end of that estimate. Reform are going to lose out. The Greens are going to lose out. Maybe the SM lose out a bit. And certainly, I mean, if you take the average of the mega polls in terms of votes and seats, we could well indeed be heading for the most disproportional electoral outcome ever. It's just that the winners and losers from the system are perhaps rather different from what we've usually talked about. Usually, often those on the left feel that Labour and the Democrats lose out from the system and the Conservatives gain. Well, I think the shoe is going to be on the other foot this time around. Yes, I think we're going to have a discussion, but where it will go, I'm not sure where it will go, because although the Labour Party is officially in favour of changing the electoral system to support representation, Sir Keir Starmer has never taken up the idea. And I think the enthusiasm of many Labour activists for proportional representation will disappear as rapidly as it did in 1997, when the party never thought it could win a dramatic overall majority. And then when it got one of 170 odd, while we had the commission from Roy Jenkins, it never, ever got put to the electorate.
Funny how that happens, isn't it?